Ezra McAllister froze mid-stride, the wooden milk pail slipping from his trembling fingers, as 700 Apache warriors materialized like ghosts along the canyon rim at dawn. The metallic clang echoed across the silent valley, spilling white streams into the red Texas dirt. They weren't here for war. They were here for the dying girl wrapped in his grandmother's patchwork quilt. Ruth McAllister's scream shattered the morning stillness as she stumbled from the farmhouse, her apron still dusted with flour from breakfast biscuits she'd never finish making. Isaiah's weathered hands found his rifle, but his arms shook like autumn leaves as childhood memories of massacre flooded back, bodies scattered like broken dolls, smoke rising from burned homes. 17-year-old Grace stirred beneath the faded quilt, her fever-bright eyes reflecting the orange sunrise as she whispered through cracked lips, "They've come for me." "Get inside, now," Isaiah commanded, though his voice cracked with the weight of 17 years' worth of buried secrets. Who was this girl that could summon an army with her dying breath? And why did 700 warriors kneel in perfect silence as a 14-year-old farm boy chose mercy over fear? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The McAllister homestead sat like a lone prayer in Canyon Creek Valley, where the Texas panhandle stretched endless and unforgiving under the brutal August sun. Drought had cracked the earth into 1,000 broken promises, and dust devils danced where green pastures once flourished. The year 1889 had brought nothing but hardship to settlers foolish enough to believe they could tame this wild land. Ezra McAllister, 14 and slight as a fence post, possessed the kind of gentle heart that seemed out of place in such harsh country. While other boys his age bragged about shooting rattlesnakes and breaking mustangs, Ezra noticed the way morning light caught dewdrops on spider webs, how injured birds trusted his quiet hands. 3 younger siblings had been buried beneath the twisted oak behind their cabin. Scarlet fever claimed them all within a single terrible winter. Since then, Ezra carried the weight of being his parents' only surviving child, their last hope in a land that devoured dreams. His father, Isaiah McAllister, bore the weathered face of a man who'd seen too much violence. At 48, the former Texas Ranger moved with the careful precision of someone expecting trouble around every corner. His steel-gray eyes held secrets that 20 years of marriage couldn't coax from him, and his calloused hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. The $800 debt to Colonel Silas Whitmore hung over their family like a vulture, patient and certain. Ruth McAllister had once been the finest nurse between San Antonio and Amarillo, her gentle touch saving countless soldiers during the war between the states. At 45, she carried herself with quiet dignity, despite the chronic pain that gnawed at her joints like a persistent ghost. The loss of 3 children had left an aching void in her heart, a maternal love with nowhere to land. She hummed forgotten lullabies while kneading bread, her voice carrying melodies meant for babies who would never hear them. Miles away in his fortress-like ranch house, Colonel Silas Whitmore controlled Canyon Creek Valley through a web of debts and dependencies. The 52-year-old former cavalry officer commanded respect through fear, his pale eyes calculating every interaction like a chess master. Settlers owed him money, merchants needed his contracts, and even the sheriff answered to his silent authority. Behind his facade of respectability lurked something darker. A man who'd learned that power meant never having to answer for the bodies left in his wake. The Apache bands had been restless lately, smoke signals rising from distant mesas like ancient prayers to forgotten gods. Local ranchers slept with rifles beside their beds, remembering stories of raids and massacre. Yet something felt different about this gathering tension, not the familiar rhythm of frontier violence, but something older and more purposeful. In this crucible of heat, debt, and buried secrets, young Ezra McAllister would soon discover that sometimes the smallest act of mercy can summon the largest army. The dying girl he'd find that morning would carry truths that could shatter the careful lies holding their world together, and 700 Apache warriors would bear witness to whether courage could triumph over the kind of evil that wore a gentleman's face. Dawn came reluctantly to Canyon Creek Valley, painting the sky the color of old blood as Ezra stepped barefoot onto the sun-warmed boards of their porch. The morning air hung thick with the promise of another scorching day, and somewhere in the distance, buzzards circled with patient hunger. He'd risen early to check on their old milk cow, Bessie, who'd been favoring her left hind leg something fierce. The wooden milk pail swung gently in his grip as he picked his way across the hardpan yard, avoiding the scattered chicken droppings and the rusty horseshoe his father kept meaning to nail back over the door for luck. Their barn sat squat and weathered at the edge of their property, where mesquite trees fought a losing battle against the relentless sun and the fence posts leaned like tired old men. That's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the morning symphony of meadowlarks and cicadas. Something between a whimper and a prayer, so faint he might have imagined it, if not for the way it made his skin prickle with unease. Ezra set down the milk pail and followed the sound around the corner of the barn, where the creek used to run before the drought turned it into nothing but cracked mud and broken dreams. She lay crumpled beneath the scraggly shade of a dying cottonwood, her dark hair spread across the earth like spilled ink. At first glance, Ezra thought she might be dead. Her skin held the waxy pallor of someone who danced too close to the grave's edge. But then, her chest rose with a shuddering breath, and her eyes fluttered open to reveal irises the color of storm clouds. The girl couldn't have been much older than 17, though suffering had carved lines around her eyes that belonged on a woman twice her age. Her dress, once fine enough for Sunday church, hung in tatters around her thin frame. Dark stains that could only be blood decorated the fabric like terrible flowers, and her bare feet were cut to ribbons from what must have been miles of desperate running. "Miss?" Ezra whispered, dropping to his knees beside her. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her lips moved soundlessly, and he leaned closer to catch her words. "Water," she managed, the sound barely more than a breath. "Please?" Ezra's heart hammered against his ribs as he looked around desperately. The nearest water was back at the house, and she looked too weak to wait that long. Without thinking, he shrugged out of his worn cotton shirt and ran toward the barn where his father kept a bucket for the horses. The water was tepid and tasted of metal, but it would have to do. When he returned, the girl had managed to prop herself against the tree trunk, though the effort left her gasping. Ezra cupped water in his hands and held it to her cracked lips, watching as she drank with the desperate thirst of someone who'd been walking through hell itself. "Thank you," she whispered, and something in her voice made him think of broken glass and lost hope. "You shouldn't. You don't know what you're risking." "Don't matter none," Ezra replied, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "You're hurt, and that's all I need to know." The girl studied his face with those storm-gray eyes, as if trying to memorize every freckle and line. "What's your name, boy?" "Ezra McAllister. This here's my family's land." He gestured toward the farmhouse, where smoke was beginning to curl from the kitchen chimney as his mother started breakfast. "What's yours?" She hesitated for a long moment, her fingers worrying at a small beaded pouch tied around her waist. "Grace," she said finally. "Grace Whitmore." The name hit Ezra like a physical blow. Everyone in Canyon Creek Valley knew the Whitmore name. Colonel Silas Whitmore owned half the county and held mortgages on the other half. His family owed the man $800 they didn't have, money borrowed for seed that had withered in the drought. Colonel Whitmore's your kin? Ezra asked, unable to keep the tension from his voice. Grace's face crumpled, and tears began to track through the dust on her cheeks. He's not what people think. He's not what anyone thinks. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I ran because I found out the truth about what he's done, about what he's still doing. Before Ezra could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both freeze. Grace's eyes went wide with terror, and she struggled to sit up straighter despite her obvious pain. Hide me, she pleaded, grabbing Ezra's wrist with surprising strength. Please, if you have any mercy in your heart, don't let him find me. Not yet. I'm not ready to die. The desperation in her voice made Ezra's decision for him. Without another word, he scooped her up in his arms, marveling at how light she felt, like a bird with hollow bones. Grace bit back a cry of pain as he carried her into the barn, where the familiar smells of hay and horse leather provided a small comfort. Up there, Grace gasped, pointing toward the hayloft. Can you manage it? The ladder rungs groaned under their combined weight, but Ezra had been climbing to that loft since he could walk. He settled Grace into a nest of sweet-smelling hay in the darkest corner, then ran back to the house for supplies. His mother's medicine bag yielded laudanum for the pain and clean bandages, while the kitchen provided bread, cold buttermilk, and strips of salted pork wrapped in brown paper. When he returned, Grace had managed to examine her wounds, a bullet graze along her ribs that had bled freely but wasn't life-threatening, and countless cuts and scrapes from her desperate flight through the thorny mesquite. She accepted the laudanum gratefully, washing it down with the cool buttermilk. You should go, she said once the medicine began to dull the sharp edges of her pain. Your family will be wondering where you are. But Ezra found himself reluctant to leave. Something about Grace Whitmore called to the part of him that had always been drawn to wounded things. The baby birds with broken wings, the stray cats with infected eyes. Will you tell me what happened? What you meant about the colonel? Grace's face went pale, and she pulled his grandmother's old patchwork quilt closer around her shoulders. The quilt had been made from scraps of fabric collected over the years, pieces of outgrown dresses, worn-out shirts, and cloth that held the memory of better times. He's not my real father, Grace whispered, her words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. My real parents died when I was small, and he took me in. I thought he saved me. But yesterday I found papers in his study, documents that proved he didn't save me at all. Her voice broke. He's the one who killed them. The revelation hung in the dusty air of the hayloft like smoke from a funeral pyre. Ezra stared at Grace, his young mind struggling to process the enormity of what she'd just confessed. Colonel Silas Whitmore, the man who held their family's debt, who controlled half the valley, who sat in the front pew of the Methodist Church every Sunday, was a murderer. That's a powerful, serious accusation, Ezra whispered, though something deep in his bones told him Grace spoke the truth. He'd always felt uneasy around the colonel, the way the man's pale eyes seemed to weigh and measure everything like a merchant counting coins. Grace reached into her beaded pouch with trembling fingers and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and stained with what might have been tears or blood. This is a deed, she said, pressing it into Ezra's hands, for mineral rights to land that stretches from here to the Caprock. My father, my real father, signed it the day before he died. There's silver under this ground, maybe gold too, enough to make a man richer than kings. Ezra unfolded the document carefully, though the formal legal language might as well have been written in Apache for all he could understand. But he could make out the signature at the bottom. James Thornton, in careful script, with the date written as August 15th, 1872. 17 years ago, when Ezra had been nothing but a dream in his parents' hearts. "Your name ain't really Whitmore," he said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "It's Thornton. Grace Elizabeth Thornton," she confirmed, her voice breaking on her real father's name. "I was 5 when they died. Old enough to remember some things, but young enough for Silas to convince me that my memories were just nightmares. He told everyone the Apache killed my parents during a raid, took me captive, and he rescued me. Made himself out to be a hero." The sound of horses approaching the house made them both freeze. Through the gaps in the barn siding, Ezra could see dust rising from the main road, multiple riders moving fast. Grace went white as fresh milk, her breathing coming in quick, shallow gasps. "He's coming," she whispered. "I knew he would. Silas always said he could track a shadow across solid rock." Ezra peered through a crack in the barn wall and counted 6 riders, their silhouettes dark against the morning sun. At their head rode a figure he recognized even at a distance. Colonel Whitmore sat his black stallion like a conquering general, his silver hair gleaming beneath his wide-brimmed hat. The men with him carried rifles across their saddles and wore the hard expressions of men accustomed to violence. "Stay quiet," Ezra told Grace, his voice steadier than he felt. "Stay hidden. I'll handle this." But before he could climb down from the loft, the farmhouse door banged open and his parents emerged onto the porch. His father held his old Spencer rifle, though Ezra noticed how Isaiah's hands shook slightly as he worked the lever. His mother stood behind her husband, her face pale with worry as she wiped flour-dusted hands on her apron. The riders reined in before the porch in a cloud of dust and jingling spurs. Colonel Whitmore dismounted with the fluid grace of a man half his age, his pale eyes scanning the homestead with calculating precision. He wore his usual black suit and string tie, looking more like a preacher than a killer, though Ezra now noticed how the man's coat hung in a way that suggested a holstered pistol beneath. "Morning, Isaiah, Ruth." Whitmore's voice carried the cultured tones of an educated man, smooth as honey over broken glass. "I apologize for the early hour, but I find myself in something of a predicament." "What can we do for you, Colonel?" Isaiah replied, though his voice held no warmth. The debt between them hung unspoken in the air like a sword waiting to fall. "My ward, Grace, has gone missing," Whitmore said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "She was unwell yesterday evening. Fever, I believe. In her delirium, she wandered off into the night. I'm organizing search parties to find her before the heat of the day makes travel dangerous." From her hiding place in the loft, Grace made a sound that might have been a bitter laugh or a stifled sob. Ezra placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, feeling how she trembled like a frightened rabbit. Ruth stepped forward, maternal concern overriding any fear of the colonel. "Oh, my stars, that poor child! How long has she been gone?" "Since sometime after midnight," Whitmore replied, though something in his eyes suggested this timeline might be flexible. "She's not in her right mind, you understand. The fever has made her confused. She might say things that don't make sense, tell wild stories." The way he emphasized the words made Ezra's skin crawl. Whitmore was laying groundwork, preparing explanations for anything Grace might say if found. The man thought of everything, planned for every contingency like the military officer he'd once been. "We haven't seen hide nor hair of her," Isaiah said carefully. "But we'll keep an eye out, naturally. I'd appreciate that greatly." Whitmore's smile never reached his eyes. "You understand, Isaiah, how important it is that Grace receives proper medical attention. She's been like a daughter to me since I rescued her from those Apache savages all those years ago. I'd hate for anything to happen to her on account of her fevered delusions." The threat in his words was subtle but unmistakable. Ezra felt his jaw clench as he recognized the implied message. Return Grace, or face the consequences. Below in the loft, Grace had gone rigid with fear, her fingers clutching the deed so tightly her knuckles had gone white. One of Whitmore's men, a hard-faced individual with a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, spoke up for the first time. "Colonel, maybe we should search the outbuildings. Girl might have taken shelter somewhere." "An excellent suggestion, Briggs." Whitmore's gaze swept over their property with the casual authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. "I'm sure the McAllisters won't mind if we take a quick look around. For the girl's safety, of course." Ezra's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized the impossible position his family now faced. If they refused the search, Whitmore would know they were hiding something. If they allowed it, Grace would be found and dragged back to face whatever fate the colonel had planned for her. The $800 debt gave Whitmore all the leverage he needed to destroy their family if they crossed him. But as Ezra looked down at Grace, really looked at her, seeing the terror in her storm-gray eyes and the way she clutched that deed like a lifeline, he made a decision that would change everything. Some things were more important than money, more important than safety, more important than the cautious calculations that kept decent people silent in the face of evil. "Papa?" Ezra called out, climbing down from the loft with deliberate slowness. "Might I have a word with you and Mama? Private-like?" Isaiah's weathered face tightened with concern, but he nodded. "Excuse us for just a moment, Colonel. Family business, you understand." As his parents approached the barn, Ezra caught his father's eye and mouthed a single word that would either save Grace Thornton or doom them all. "Truth." The barn fell silent except for the soft shuffling of horses and the distant sound of Colonel Whitmore's men checking their weapons. Ezra's heart thundered in his chest as his parents approached, their faces etched with the kind of worry that comes from years of walking the razor's edge between survival and ruin. "Son," Isaiah whispered, his voice barely audible over the morning breeze. "What in tarnation is going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ruth's maternal instincts kicked in immediately, her practiced eye taking in Ezra's disheveled appearance and the hay clinging to his hair. "Ezra McAllister, you haven't been sleeping in that loft again, have you? I've told you a dozen times. Mama, please." Ezra glanced toward the farmhouse, where Whitmore stood with military posture, his pale eyes scanning their property like a hawk searching for prey. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen with your whole hearts before you make any decisions." Isaiah's weathered face tightened with concern. At 48, the former Texas Ranger had developed an instinct for trouble that had kept him alive through Indian raids, cattle rustlers, and the bloody years of Reconstruction. Something in his son's voice triggered every alarm bell in his head. "Speak plain, boy," Isaiah said, though his voice carried none of its usual authority. "What's got you spooked?" Ezra took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either save Grace Thornton or damn his entire family. "She's up there," he said simply, nodding toward the hayloft. "Grace Whitmore. Only that ain't her real name." Ruth's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. "Sweet Jesus, Ezra, what have you done?" "I found her by the creek at dawn, half dead and bleeding," Ezra continued, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "She's been shot, Mama. Running for her life. And she told me things about the colonel that would make your blood turn cold." Isaiah's face had gone white as old bones. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his rifle tighter, and for a moment he looked every one of his 48 years. "What kind of things, son?" "She ain't his daughter," Ezra whispered. "Her real name is Grace Thornton, and 17 years ago Colonel Whitmore murdered her parents for their land, mineral rights, Papa, silver and maybe gold under the ground from here to the Cap Rock." The words hit Isaiah like a physical blow. His knees nearly buckled, and Ruth had to steady him with a firm hand on his arm. The color drained from his face as memories he'd spent 17 years trying to forget came flooding back like a dam bursting. "Thornton," Isaiah repeated, the name falling from his lips like a prayer or a curse. James and Elizabeth Thornton. Ruth looked between her husband and son, confusion evident in her gentle brown eyes. "Isaiah, what is it? You look like you've seen the devil himself." Isaiah's voice came out as barely a whisper, cracked with the weight of years of buried guilt. "Because I have, Ruth, sweet Lord above, I have." He turned to Ezra with haunted eyes. "Where is she, son? Where's the girl?" Instead of answering, Ezra began climbing the ladder to the hayloft. His parents followed, Ruth struggling slightly with her chronic joint pain, but determined not to be left behind. They found Grace huddled in the far corner, wrapped in Grandmother Abigail's patchwork quilt like a wounded bird seeking shelter from a storm. The sight of her hit Ruth with the force of a revelation. 17 years of accumulated maternal love, stored up with no outlet since the deaths of her other children, came pouring out in a single moment. Grace's storm-gray eyes, hollow with suffering and bright with fever, reminded Ruth of every patient she'd nursed during the war, every wounded soul she'd tried to heal. "Oh, honey," Ruth breathed, moving toward Grace with the gentle efficiency of a born healer. "Look what they've done to you." Grace shrank back initially, unused to kindness without strings attached. But something in Ruth's voice, the genuine warmth, the maternal concern, broke through her defenses. When Ruth reached out to check her temperature, Grace didn't flinch. "You're burning up with fever," Ruth diagnosed, her medical training taking over. "How long have you been running?" 2 days, Grace whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. "Maybe 3. Time gets strange when you're dying." Isaiah knelt beside his wife, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. When Grace looked up at him, recognition flickered in her eyes, not of him specifically, but of something familiar in his weathered features. "You were there," Grace said suddenly, her fever-bright gaze locking onto Isaiah's face. "The night they died, you were there, weren't you?" The question hung in the dusty air of the loft like an accusation. Isaiah's hands began to shake violently, and for a moment he looked like he might collapse entirely. Ruth reached out to steady him, confusion and growing alarm evident in her expression. "Isaiah," she said carefully. "What is she talking about?" The former Texas Ranger closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with 17 years of accumulated guilt and shame. "I was on patrol that night," he said, his voice barely audible. "August 15th, 1872. Heard gunshots coming from the Thornton place. By the time I got there—" His voice broke, and he had to stop to compose himself. Grace watched him with the intensity of someone whose entire world hung on his next words. "By the time I got there," Isaiah continued, "the house was burning. I saw riders leaving, 6 of them, led by a man on a black horse. I should have pursued them, should have raised the alarm, but you didn't," Grace finished for him, her voice devoid of accusation. "You were afraid." Isaiah nodded miserably. "I had a wife and baby son to think about. Times were hard and Whitmore controlled half the jobs in the valley. I told myself there was nothing I could do for the dead, but I could still protect the living." Ruth's face had gone pale as the full magnitude of her husband's secret became clear. "You've known all these years, known that Silas Whitmore was a murderer, and you said nothing?" "He owns our debt, Ruth." Isaiah's voice cracked with anguish. $800 we don't have. If I'd spoken up, he would have ruined us, taken the farm, left us with nothing. I convinced myself that the girl was better off believing her parents died in an Apache raid. At least that way she had a home, food, a future. Grace pulled the yellowed deed from her beaded pouch and held it out to Isaiah with trembling fingers. "This is what he killed them for," she said. "Mineral rights to land worth more than some men see in a lifetime. My father signed it the day before he died, planning to provide for my future. Instead, it became his death warrant." Ruth took the document with reverent care, her nursing experience having taught her to handle precious things gently. Though the legal language was beyond her education, she could see the careful signature at the bottom, the official seals that marked it as genuine. "Sweet Lord," she whispered, "all these years, and you never knew?" "I remembered some things," Grace said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Fragments, mostly. The way my real father used to read to me before bed, how my mother hummed while she cooked. But Silas convinced me they were just dreams, fantasies my mind created to cope with trauma. The sound of boots on the barn floor below made them all freeze." Colonel Whitmore's voice carried up to the loft, smooth and cultured, but with an edge of steel beneath. "I hope you don't mind, Isaiah, but my men are conducting a thorough search. For the girl's safety, you understand." Ezra looked at his parents with desperate eyes. "What do we do if they find her?" "They won't take her," Ruth said firmly, surprising everyone with the steel in her voice. The gentlewoman who hummed lullabies and tended wounded animals had transformed into something fierce and protective. "Not while there's breath in my body." Isaiah stared at his wife in amazement. In 20 years of marriage, he'd never seen this side of Ruth, the warrior that lived beneath the healer's gentle exterior. But then again, she'd never had a daughter to protect before. "Ruth, you don't understand the position this puts us in," Isaiah said desperately. "The debt, the farm, everything we've worked for—" "Some things matter more than money, Isaiah McAllister," Ruth interrupted, her voice ringing with moral certainty. "This child has been through hell, and I'll be damned if I'm going to hand her back to the devil just to keep our heads above water." Grace looked between the three McAllisters with wonder in her storm-gray eyes. For 17 years, she'd lived in a world where every kindness came with a price, where love was conditional and protection depended on usefulness. The sight of this family choosing to risk everything for a stranger's daughter awakened something in her that she'd thought was dead. "You don't owe me anything," she whispered. "I'm nobody to you." Ezra moved closer to her, his young face set with determination that made him look older than his 14 years. "That ain't true," he said firmly. "You're somebody who needed help, and we're somebody who can give it. That's all that matters." The wisdom in those words, coming from someone barely past childhood, silenced the adults. Ruth felt tears prick her eyes as she realized that somehow, despite all their losses and hardships, she and Isaiah had managed to raise a son with the kind of moral courage that could change the world. The sound of footsteps on the ladder rungs made them all tense. One of Whitmore's men was climbing up to search the loft, his spurs jingling with each step. Grace pressed herself deeper into the corner, pulling the patchwork quilt over her head like a shield. Ruth moved with swift purpose, positioning herself in front of Grace while Isaiah stood between his family and the approaching danger. Ezra remained beside Grace, one protective hand on her shoulder, ready to face whatever came next. The searcher's head appeared above the loft floor. A hard-faced man with cold eyes and the kind of mustache favored by those who believed facial hair made them look more intimidating. He swept his gaze across the hay-strewn space, taking in the McAllister family's defensive positioning with calculating intelligence. "Well, well," the man said, climbing fully into the loft. "What have we here? Family meeting in the hayloft? That's mighty peculiar behavior, if you ask me." "Nobody asked you, Briggs," Isaiah replied, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "This is private property, and you've got no right to be here." Briggs smiled, revealing yellowed teeth that spoke of too much tobacco and too little care. "Oh, but I do have the right, McAllister. See, Colonel Whitmore holds your paper, which means he holds your destiny." And right now, he's real interested in finding his missing ward. The man's eyes swept the loft again, lingering on the pile of quilts where Grace hid. Something in his expression suggested he knew exactly what he was looking at, but was enjoying the game of cat and mouse. Funny thing about hiding places, Briggs continued conversationally, they're only as good as the people willing to keep secrets. And secret keeping can be mighty expensive for folks in your position. Down below, they could hear Colonel Whitmore's voice directing his other men to search the chicken coop, the smokehouse, the root cellar. Time was running out, and everyone in the loft knew it. The tension in the hayloft stretched tight as a fiddle string as Briggs took another step forward, his cold eyes fixed on the pile of quilts where Grace lay hidden. The morning sun slanted through the gaps in the barn siding, casting prison bar shadows across the hay-strewn floor. Below them, the sounds of systematic searching continued. Boots on wooden floors, doors creaking open, the methodical investigation of men who knew their business. "You know, McAllister," Briggs said conversationally, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered pistol, "the Colonel's been mighty patient with your family's debt situation. $800 is a considerable sum for folks in your position. But patience ain't infinite, if you catch my meaning." Isaiah's jaw clenched, but he held his ground. Years of ranger training had taught him to recognize when a man was fishing versus when he actually knew something. Briggs was testing, probing for reactions, but the way his eyes kept sliding away from the quilt suggested he hadn't spotted Grace yet. "I catch your meaning just fine," Isaiah replied evenly. "But that don't change the fact that we ain't seen hide nor hair of the Colonel's ward." Ruth stepped forward slightly, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. That poor child, wandering around in the heat with a fever. She could die out there if she don't get proper care soon. The genuine concern in Ruth's voice seemed to give Briggs pause. He studied her face with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to reading people for signs of deception. But Ruth's worry was entirely real. She was terrified for Grace's safety, just not in the way Briggs assumed. "Now that's what I like to hear," Briggs said, relaxing slightly. "Christian charity toward a sick girl. The Colonel will be pleased to know you folks are taking this seriously." From beneath the quilts, Grace fought to control her breathing. The laudanum Ezra had given her was wearing off, and pain lanced through her ribs with each heartbeat. Worse than the physical agony was the psychological torment of hearing Briggs's voice, knowing that men like him had been hunting her for 2 days like a rabbit run to ground. Ezra remained motionless beside the quilts, his 14-year-old mind racing through possibilities. He could feel Grace trembling beneath the patchwork fabric, could sense how close she was to breaking entirely. The weight of responsibility, for her safety, for his family's future, for doing what was right in a world that often punished righteousness, pressed down on his young shoulders like a physical burden. "Tell you what," Briggs continued, moving closer to the quilts with predatory slowness. "Why don't we just take a quick look around this loft? Make sure there ain't no place a delirious girl might have crawled to hide." "Already looked," Isaiah lied smoothly. "First place we checked when you mentioned she was missing. Nothing up here but hay and old memories." Briggs paused, studying Isaiah's weathered face for tells. The former ranger kept his expression neutral, drawing on decades of experience dealing with dangerous men. But inside, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The sound of boots climbing the ladder again made them all tense. Another of Whitmore's men appeared, a younger fellow with nervous eyes and hands that shook slightly when he thought no one was looking. This one lacked Briggs's cold confidence, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning coolness. "Briggs," the newcomer called out, "Colonel wants us to wrap this up. Says we're wasting time here when the girl could be miles away by now." Briggs looked disappointed, like a cat denied the chance to play with a captured mouse. "Shame," he said, though his eyes lingered on the McAllister family with unmistakable threat. "I was just getting acquainted with our hosts here." Below them, Colonel Whitmore's cultured voice rang out with military authority. "Briggs, Reynolds, form up. We're moving to the Patterson place." "Coming, Colonel," Briggs called back, but he didn't immediately move toward the ladder. Instead, he stepped closer to the quilts, close enough that Grace could have reached out and touched his boot. The smell of him, tobacco, gun oil, and unwashed wool, made her stomach lurch with remembered terror. "Funny thing about secrets, McAllister," Briggs said quietly, his voice pitched low so only those in the loft could hear. "They have a way of coming out eventually. And when they do, well, debts have a way of becoming due all at once." With that parting threat, he touched the brim of his hat in mock courtesy and descended the ladder. Reynolds followed immediately, relief evident in his hasty retreat. The sound of their spurs jingling grew fainter as they moved away from the barn. The McAllister family remained frozen for several long minutes, listening to the sounds of horses being mounted and men riding away. Only when the hoofbeats had faded entirely did they dare to breathe normally again. Grace emerged from beneath the quilts like a ghost returning to the world of the living. Her face was pale as moonlight, and tears tracked through the dust on her cheeks. The terror in her storm-gray eyes spoke of someone who had seen too much evil to ever feel truly safe again. "They'll be back," she whispered, her voice hoarse with fear and despair. "Silas never gives up. Never. He'll search every inch of this valley until he finds me." Ruth moved to Grace's side with gentle efficiency, her healer's instincts taking over. She felt the girl's forehead, checked her pulse, examined the bandages Ezra had applied earlier. The fever was climbing again, and infection reddened the edges of the bullet wound. "First things first," Ruth said firmly. "We need to get proper medicine into you and clean these wounds better. Ezra, fetch my good needle and the silk thread. This needs stitching." "Mama," Ezra protested, "what if they come back while we're tending her?" "Then they'll find us doing the Lord's work," Ruth replied with steel in her voice. "I've patched up wounded souls from Shiloh to San Antonio, and I ain't about to let this child suffer for lack of proper care." Isaiah watched his wife work with a mixture of admiration and terror. In the 20 years they'd been married, he'd never seen Ruth so fiercely protective. The loss of their 3 children had left her with an aching void that Grace's presence seemed to fill, awakening maternal instincts that had been dormant for too long. "Ruth," he said carefully, "you know what this means, don't you? If we help her, if we take her side against Whitmore, there ain't no going back. He'll ruin us for certain." Ruth's hands never paused in their gentle ministrations as she cleaned Grace's wounds with practiced skill. "Some things are worth being ruined for, Isaiah McAllister, and saving an innocent child from a monster is surely one of them." Grace looked up at Ruth with wonder, as if she'd never encountered such unconditional kindness before. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk everything for someone like me?" "Because, honey child," Ruth said softly, "you ain't someone like you. You're Grace Elizabeth Thornton, daughter of James and Elizabeth, and you deserve to live free from fear. Every child does." The sound of distant gunshots made them all freeze. The reports came from the direction of the Patterson place, 3 quick cracks followed by shouting. Through the barn's open door they could see smoke rising from beyond the ridge. "Dear God," Isaiah breathed, "what has that madman done now?" Ezra climbed down from the loft and peered through the barn door. In the distance he could see riders moving fast across the scrubland, too far away to identify but close enough to suggest urgency. More smoke was rising now, black and thick against the morning sky. "Papa?" Ezra called up to the loft. "Something bad's happening out there. Real bad." Isaiah descended the ladder with grim purpose, his ranger instincts overriding his farmer's caution. He'd seen enough violence in his lifetime to recognize the signs, and the smoke told a story he didn't want to believe. "The Patterson family," he said quietly. "Jim Patterson's got a wife and 3 little ones. If Whitmore thinks they're harboring Grace—" He didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood the implications. Colonel Silas Whitmore was escalating his search, and anyone who stood in his way would face consequences that made debt forgiveness seem trivial by comparison. Grace struggled to sit up, despite Ruth's gentle protests. "It's my fault," she said, guilt and anguish thick in her voice. "People are dying because of me, because I was too much of a coward to die quiet and convenient." "Now you listen to me, Grace Elizabeth," Ruth said firmly, gripping the girl's shoulders. "You ain't responsible for that monster's choices. The only person to blame for Silas Whitmore's evil is Silas Whitmore himself." But Grace wasn't convinced. The weight of 17 years' worth of manipulated guilt pressed down on her like a physical force. Whitmore had spent her entire conscious life teaching her that she was nothing without his protection, that she owed him everything, that any suffering she caused others was her fault for being ungrateful. "You don't understand," Grace said desperately. "He saved me from the Apache, gave me a home and education, everything. And this is how I repay him, bringing death and destruction to innocent families." "Child," Isaiah said quietly, climbing back up to the loft, "that man didn't save you from the Apache. He saved you from the truth. There's a powerful difference." The distant smoke continued to rise, and with it came the sound of more horses, many more horses. But these riders approached from the east, moving with a different rhythm than Whitmore's search parties. The hoofbeats carried an almost ceremonial cadence, like mourners following a funeral procession. Ezra's sharp eyes caught movement on the eastern ridge first. "Papa," he called out, his voice tight with amazement and fear, "you need to see this." Isaiah joined his son at the barn door, and what he saw there made his blood run cold. Silhouetted against the morning sun, a line of riders stretched across the ridge like dark shadows against the sky. Apache warriors, mounted on painted ponies, sitting motionless as stone guardians. "Sweet Jesus," Isaiah breathed. "How many do you count?" Ezra squinted against the glare, trying to make out individual figures in the distant line. 20, 30. "Papa, they keep coming. There's more appearing all the time." Up in the loft, Grace heard their conversation and struggled to her feet despite Ruth's protests. She made her way to a gap in the barn siding and peered out at the growing assembly on the ridge. What she saw there made her gasp with recognition and something that might have been relief. "They're not here for war," she said softly. "They're here for justice." Ruth looked between Grace and the men below, confusion evident in her gentle features. "Honey, what are you talking about? How do you know what they want?" Grace's storm-gray eyes held secrets that seemed too heavy for someone so young to carry. "Because," she said quietly, "I lived with them for 2 years before Silas found me and dragged me back. They know who I really am. They know what he's done." The revelation hit the McAllister family like a physical blow. Everything they thought they knew about Grace's story was shifting, revealing layers of truth that made the situation far more complex and dangerous than they'd imagined. "You lived with the Apache?" Ezra asked, his young mind struggling to process this new information. "After I escaped the first time," Grace confirmed. "I was 15, and I'd started remembering things about my real parents. Silas caught me looking through his papers, asking questions he didn't want answered. So I ran." The line of warriors on the ridge continued to grow, their numbers swelling like a gathering storm. What had started as a handful of riders now numbered in the dozens, with more appearing from hidden draws and canyon passages. They sat their horses with the patience of mountains waiting for something that only they understood. And as the morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across Canyon Creek Valley, it became clear that the small drama playing out in the McAllister barn was about to become something much larger, a reckoning that had been 17 years in the making. The number of Apache warriors on the eastern ridge had swollen to over 100 by midday, their silhouettes creating a dark line against the blazing Texas sky. They sat motionless as carved stone, neither advancing nor retreating, simply watching the valley below with the patience of men who had learned that justice moved on its own timeline. Grace's fever had broken during the morning, but weakness still plagued her as she sat propped against hay bales in the loft. Ruth had done what she could with needle and thread, stitching the bullet wound with the skill of someone who had sewn too many torn bodies back together. The girl's breathing came easier now, though pain still flickered across her features whenever she moved. "Tell us about your time with them," Ruth said gently, settling beside Grace with a cup of willow bark tea that would help with the pain. "How did you come to live with the Apache?" Grace accepted the bitter tea gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic cup as if drawing strength from it. "When I ran the first time, I was half dead from thirst when they found me, a hunting party led by Chief Running Bear. I thought they'd kill me, or worse." Ezra leaned forward, fascination overcoming his fear. At 14, the idea of living with Apache warriors seemed like something from a dime novel, too extraordinary to be real. "But they didn't hurt you?" he asked. "No," Grace said, a small smile touching her lips for the first time since they'd found her. Running Bear's wife, White Dove, had lost a daughter to the cavalry the year before. She saw something in me, maybe the same desperate wildness her own child had carried. They took me in, taught me their ways. Isaiah climbed back into the loft, his face grim with worry. "The smoke from the Patterson place has died down," he reported. "But I can see riders moving this direction. Whitmore's coming back, and he's got more men with him now." The approaching confrontation weighed on all of them like a storm building on the horizon. Through gaps in the barn siding, they could see dust clouds rising from two directions: Whitmore's search party returning from the west, and something else approaching from the south. The valley was filling with armed men, and the McAllister family found themselves at the center of forces they couldn't control. "Grace," Ruth said carefully, "if those warriors up there know who you are, why haven't they come down? Why are they just waiting?" Grace's storm-gray eyes took on a distant quality, as if she were seeing beyond the physical world into something deeper. "Because this isn't their fight to finish," she said quietly. "They're here to bear witness. To make sure the truth doesn't get buried again." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of saddle leather. Through the barn door they could see Colonel Whitmore leading a column of at least 20 armed men, their faces hard with the kind of purpose that came from being well paid to ask no questions. But something had changed in Whitmore's demeanor. The calculated composure he usually wore like expensive clothing had cracked, revealing something desperate and dangerous underneath. His black suit was dusty and disheveled, his silver hair no longer perfectly arranged. Most telling of all, his pale eyes had taken on the wild quality of a cornered animal. "McAllister!" Whitmore's voice rang across the farmyard, no longer smooth and cultured, but raw with barely controlled fury. "I know you're harboring her. I can smell the deception on you like smoke." Isaiah descended from the loft once more, his Spencer rifle held ready but not yet aimed. Ruth and Ezra remained hidden above, positioned to protect Grace if the situation deteriorated beyond words. "Colonel!" Isaiah called out, stepping into the barn doorway where Whitmore could see him clearly. "I told you before, we ain't seen your ward, but maybe you could explain why the Patterson place is burning?" Whitmore dismounted from his black stallion with jerky, agitated movements. Up close, the signs of his deteriorating mental state were even more apparent. His hands shook slightly, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning coolness. Jim Patterson was hiding her, Whitmore said, his voice carrying a manic edge. Lying to my face, same as you're doing now. He paid the price for that betrayal, him and his whole worthless family. The casual way he spoke of multiple deaths sent ice through Isaiah's veins. Whatever restraint had governed Whitmore's actions in the past was clearly gone, burned away by desperation and the growing pressure of his carefully constructed lies unraveling. "You killed the Patterson family?" Isaiah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did what was necessary," Whitmore replied, his pale eyes blazing with self-righteous fury. "Just like I'm prepared to do here. That girl belongs to me, McAllister. I saved her, raised her, gave her everything. She's mine by right of rescue, and I'll burn this entire valley to get her back." Up in the loft, Grace felt the familiar weight of guilt and manipulation pressing down on her like a physical force. For 17 years, Whitmore had used these same arguments to control her, to make her feel that any suffering she caused others was her fault for being ungrateful. But Ruth's gentle hand on her shoulder reminded her that she wasn't alone anymore. The kindness of strangers had shown her a different way of being in the world, one where love didn't come with conditions and protection didn't require absolute submission. "He's lost his mind," Grace whispered, though she wasn't entirely surprised. She'd seen signs of Whitmore's growing instability in recent months. The way he talked to people who weren't there, the violent rages over minor infractions, the increasing paranoia about threats to his control. The confrontation below escalated as more of Whitmore's men dismounted and spread out around the farmyard. These weren't local cowboys or desperate drifters, but professional gunmen with the cold eyes of men who killed for money. Their presence transformed the simple homestead into a potential battleground. "I'm going to count to 10, McAllister," Whitmore announced, drawing his service revolver with theatrical precision. "If that girl isn't standing before me by the time I reach 10, I'll burn this place down around your ears." 1, 2... But before he could continue, a new sound echoed across the valley. A low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. The Apache warriors on the ridge had begun to chant, their voices joining in an ancient song that spoke of justice and judgment. Whitmore's men looked nervously toward the ridge, where the line of warriors had grown to nearly 200. The professional gunmen were accustomed to intimidating farmers and shopkeepers, not facing down what amounted to a small army of legendary fighters. 3, 4, Whitmore continued, but his voice had lost some of its authority. The drumming and chanting seemed to unnerve him, stirring memories of campaigns fought against these same people years earlier. From the southern approach, another dust cloud appeared, this one raised by a different kind of rider entirely. A lone figure on horseback, moving with the steady pace of someone who carried legitimate authority rather than manufactured fear. "Colonel Whitmore!" The voice carried clearly across the valley, backed by the unmistakable authority of federal law. "This is Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley. You're wanted for questioning in connection with multiple murders." The arrival of federal law enforcement changed everything. Whitmore's men began to shift nervously, some already edging toward their horses. They'd signed on to intimidate farmers and search for a runaway girl, not to face down U.S. Marshals with Apache warriors providing an ominous backdrop. "This is impossible," Whitmore muttered, his careful plans disintegrating around him like smoke in the wind. How could they know? Who could have told them? From her position in the loft, Grace finally understood the full scope of what was happening. The Apache warriors weren't just here as witnesses. They'd been gathering evidence, preparing for this moment when the truth could finally be told without fear of retribution. 5, 6. Whitmore continued counting, but his voice was barely audible now. The revelation that federal authorities were involved had shattered his remaining composure, revealing the frightened, desperate man beneath the facade of respectability. The drumming from the ridge grew louder, joined now by war cries that echoed off the canyon walls like the voices of the dead themselves demanding justice. It was a sound that spoke to something primal in the human soul, a reminder that some wrongs could never be forgotten or forgiven. As Deputy Marshal Bradley rode closer, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun, it became clear that the careful balance of power that had kept Canyon Creek Valley in Whitmore's grip for 17 years was finally crumbling. The time for secrets and silence was ending, and with it would come either justice or a bloodbath that would stain the Texas soil for generations to come. Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley's arrival shattered the tense standoff like a stone thrown through glass. The federal lawman sat his bay horse with the easy confidence of someone who'd faced down killers from Kansas to the Rio Grande, his weathered face showing no fear despite being outnumbered 20-1. The star pinned to his vest caught the afternoon light, a symbol of authority that even Whitmore's hired guns recognized and respected. "Colonel Silas Whitmore," Bradley called out, his voice carrying the weight of legal certainty. "You're under arrest for the murders of James and Elizabeth Thornton, Jim and Mary Patterson and their 3 children, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government of mineral rights belonging to deceased citizens." The formal charges hung in the dusty air like the tolling of funeral bells. Whitmore's face went white as old bones, then flushed red with a rage so intense it seemed to radiate heat. His carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation was collapsing around him, and the man who had controlled Canyon Creek Valley through fear and debt was suddenly facing the full weight of federal justice. "This is impossible," Whitmore snarled, his service revolver still trained on the McAllister farmhouse. "You have no proof, no witnesses, just the word of savages and criminals." Bradley smiled grimly, reaching into his saddlebag to withdraw a thick manila envelope. "Actually, Colonel, I have quite a bit more than that, including testimony from a certain young lady who's been very helpful in documenting your crimes over the past 17 years. From the barn loft, Grace gasped as the implication hit her. Someone else had survived Whitmore's reign of terror, someone who had been gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment to strike back. The realization that she wasn't alone in her fight against the monster who had destroyed her family filled her with a fierce joy she hadn't felt in years. "Who?" Whitmore demanded, his pale eyes wild with paranoia. "Who dares speak against me? I'll see them hang for perjury." "Why don't you ask her yourself?" Bradley replied, gesturing toward the Apache warriors on the ridge. As if summoned by his words, a single figure detached itself from the line of mounted warriors and began riding down the slope toward the farmstead. But this wasn't one of Running Bear's braves. It was an elderly white woman, her silver hair braided in the Apache fashion, her weathered face bearing the dignity of someone who had survived unspeakable hardships. Isaiah's breath caught in his throat as recognition dawned. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, "it's Grandmother Abigail." The woman who approached had been presumed dead for over 2 years, vanished without a trace from her cabin near the canyon rim. Ezra had loved his grandmother fiercely, and her disappearance had left a hole in the family that nothing could fill. Now here she was, alive and strong, riding toward them like an avenging angel wrapped in buckskin and determination. Grandmother Abigail McAllister dismounted near the barn, her movements showing the careful precision of someone well into her 70s, but still vital. Her blue eyes, so like Ezra's own, sparkled with a mixture of love and steel as she surveyed the confrontation before her. "Hello, Silas," she said calmly, as if greeting an old acquaintance at church social rather than facing down a desperate killer. "Been wondering when this day would come." Whitmore's gun hand began to shake violently as he stared at the woman he'd believed safely dead and buried. You're supposed to be. I saw the blood, the signs of struggle." "You saw what I wanted you to see," Abigail replied with quiet satisfaction. Amazing what a woman can accomplish when she puts her mind to it, and when she has friends willing to help her disappear long enough to gather the evidence needed to hang a murdering snake. She reached into a beaded pouch at her waist and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and filled with careful handwriting. 2 years I've been documenting your crimes, Silas. Every stolen deed, every murdered family, every child you've orphaned for the sake of your greed. It's all here in black and white." The revelation hit Whitmore like a physical blow. His legs nearly buckled as he realized the full scope of his exposure. Not only had his carefully buried past been unearthed, but someone had been systematically documenting his ongoing crimes for years. "Impossible," he muttered, but his voice had lost all its former authority. "No one would believe the word of an old woman who's been living with savages." "Maybe not," Abigail agreed amiably. "But they might believe the word of 17 different families whose land you've stolen, or the testimony of the 3 Apache scouts who witnessed you shooting the Patterson children while they tried to run, or perhaps the bank records showing how you've been forging deeds and manipulating debts to steal mineral rights across half the territory." Each revelation was like another nail in Whitmore's coffin. His hired guns began to edge away from him, recognizing that their employer situation had become untenable. Professional killers might work for pay, but they had no interest in swinging from federal gallows for a lost cause. Deputy Marshal Bradley dismounted and began walking toward Whitmore with deliberate slowness, his own weapon still holstered but ready. "It's over, Colonel. Put down your gun and surrender peacefully, and I'll see that you get a fair trial." "Fair trial?" Whitmore laughed, but the sound held no humor, only the bitter madness of a man watching his empire crumble. "There's no fairness in this world, Marshal. Only power, and the will to use it." He swung his revolver toward Grandmother Abigail, his finger tightening on the trigger. "If I'm going to hang, then I'll take some of my enemies with me." The shot that rang out across Canyon Creek Valley didn't come from Whitmore's gun. Isaiah's Spencer rifle spoke first, the heavy bullet taking the colonel in the shoulder and spinning him around like a child's top. Whitmore's revolver discharged harmlessly into the air as he crumpled to the dusty ground, his shooting arm shattered and useless. "That's for 17 years of cowardice," Isaiah said grimly, working the lever action to chamber another round. "And for every family you've destroyed with your lies." Up in the barn loft, Grace felt a mixture of relief and profound sadness wash over her. The man who had terrorized her for most of her life lay broken in the dirt, no longer the towering figure of menace that had haunted her nightmares. He was just a pathetic old man, consumed by greed and hatred until there was nothing left of whatever humanity he might once have possessed. Ruth climbed down from the loft and helped Grace follow, supporting the injured girl as they emerged into the afternoon sunlight. For the first time in years, Grace felt truly safe, surrounded by people who cared for her without expecting anything in return. Deputy Marshal Bradley moved quickly to secure Whitmore's weapon and assess his injuries. The shoulder wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening. The colonel would live to stand trial for his crimes, assuming proper medical attention. "Mrs. McAllister," Bradley said formally, turning to Grandmother Abigail, "I'll need you to accompany me back to Fort Worth to provide formal testimony. Your evidence will be crucial in securing convictions for all of Whitmore's associates." "Be my pleasure," Abigail replied, then turned to embrace her grandson. Ezra buried his face against her shoulder, overcome with emotion at having his beloved grandmother returned from what they'd believed was the grave. "Thought we'd lost you for good," he whispered, his voice thick with tears. "Takes more than one snake to kill an old badger like me," Abigail replied, stroking his hair with gentle hands. "Besides, I had work to finish. Couldn't rest easy knowing that monster was still breathing free air." Grace approached them hesitantly, uncertain of her place in this family reunion. But Abigail's weathered face broke into a warm smile as she saw the girl, and she opened her arms wide enough to encompass both Ezra and Grace in the same embrace. "And you must be Grace Elizabeth Thornton," Abigail said warmly. "I knew your parents, child. Good people, both of them. They'd be proud of the woman you've become." The words broke through the last of Grace's emotional defenses. For 17 years, she'd been told she was nothing without Whitmore's protection, that she owed him everything for saving her from a terrible fate. But here was an old woman who remembered her real parents, who validated her true identity in a way that felt like coming home. "Are they really all dead?" Grace asked, her voice small and uncertain. "The Patterson family, even the children?" Grandmother Abigail's face grew grave. "I'm afraid so, child. Silas lost what little sanity he had left when he realized his lies were finally catching up with him. But their deaths won't be in vain if they help bring justice for all his victims." The Apache warriors on the ridge began to disperse, their vigil complete now that justice was being served. Chief Running Bear rode down to speak briefly with Grace in their shared language, his weathered face showing satisfaction that the spirits of the murdered could finally rest in peace. As the sun began to set over Canyon Creek Valley, casting long shadows across the land that had seen so much suffering, the surviving members of the community began the long process of healing. Whitmore's empire of fear was broken. His stolen wealth would be returned to its rightful owners, and the children he had orphaned could finally know the truth about their parents' deaths. But perhaps, most importantly, Grace Elizabeth Thornton had found a family who chose to love her not because they owed her anything, but simply because love was what families did. In the gathering twilight, surrounded by people who would protect her without expecting payment, she finally understood what it meant to be truly safe. The nightmare that had begun 17 years ago with gunshots in the night was finally ending, and with it came the promise of a new beginning built on truth, love, and the kind of courage that could change the world, one small act of kindness at a time. 6 months after the confrontation that brought down Colonel Silas Whitmore, Canyon Creek Valley had transformed into something resembling the peaceful community it was always meant to be. The federal trial in Fort Worth had lasted 3 weeks, with Grandmother Abigail's meticulous documentation serving as the cornerstone of a case that saw Whitmore sentenced to hang for his crimes. His network of hired guns and corrupt officials crumbled like a house built on sand, their loyalty lasting only as long as the money that had bought it. Grace Elizabeth Thornton, she had legally reclaimed her birth name, sat at the kitchen table in the McAllister farmhouse, helping Ruth prepare Sunday dinner while Ezra read aloud from the family Bible. The bullet wound in her ribs had healed cleanly under Ruth's careful ministrations, leaving only a thin white scar as reminder of how close she'd come to joining her parents in death. "And the Lord said unto Moses," Ezra read in his clear young voice, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows." The words seemed particularly fitting, Grace thought, as she watched the bustling activity around her. After 17 years of believing herself alone in the world, she had discovered not just a family willing to claim her, but an entire community eager to make amends for their years of fearful silence. The adoption papers had been signed 3 months ago, making Grace officially a McAllister. Ruth had wept tears of joy at finally having a daughter to fuss over, while Isaiah had surprised everyone by admitting that having Grace in the house reminded him daily of the importance of speaking truth, even when silence seemed safer. Through the kitchen window, Grace could see Chief Running Bear and several of his warriors sharing an afternoon meal with some of the local ranchers. The peace treaty signed after Whitmore's arrest had led to unprecedented cooperation between the Apache bands and the remaining settlers. Trade agreements had replaced raids, and children who might have grown up as enemies now played together in the dusty streets of Canyon Creek. "Grace, honey," Ruth called from the stove where she was checking on a pot roast that smelled like heaven itself. "Would you mind calling the men in for dinner? And tell your grandfather that if he's late to his own table again, he'll be eating cold biscuits." Grandfather. The title still made Grace smile. Grandmother Abigail had returned from Fort Worth with stories that would fuel winter conversations for years to come. But more importantly, she'd brought with her the recovered deeds to dozens of properties that Whitmore had stolen through murder and fraud. The mineral rights that had cost Grace's parents their lives were now legally hers, making her one of the wealthiest young women in Texas territory. But wealth seemed less important now than the simple pleasure of belonging somewhere. Grace stepped onto the front porch and called to the men gathered around the corral, where Isaiah was showing Running Bear's youngest son how to gentle a Mustang with patience rather than force. "Dinner's ready," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the farmyard. Ezra looked up from his book and grinned at her. At 15, he'd grown 3 inches and developed the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing he'd done the right thing when it mattered most. The boy who had given his grandmother's blanket to a dying stranger had become something of a local legend, though he bore the attention with characteristic modesty. "You know what Grandmother Abigail told me yesterday," he said, closing the Bible and setting it carefully on the side table. "What's that?" Grace asked, settling beside him on the porch swing that Isaiah had built especially for the two of them. "She said that sometimes the Lord works through ordinary folks doing extraordinary things, and sometimes He works through extraordinary folks doing ordinary things, like sharing a blanket." Grace smiled, thinking of the patchwork quilt that now hung in a place of honor above the fireplace. Grandmother Abigail had revealed its true history, patches cut from the uniforms of Texas Rangers who had died serving their communities, including fabric from Grace's own father's captain stripes. "I reckon," Grace said, watching the sun set over the valley that had finally become home, "the Lord works through love. Everything else is just details." Sometimes life hands us seasons that feel like endless winter, watching friends pass on, feeling forgotten by busy children, facing health scares that remind us how fragile everything truly is. But Grace's story reminds us that even when we feel most alone, love has a way of finding us through unexpected people who choose to see our worth. Like 14-year-old Ezra wrapping a stranger in his grandmother's quilt, kindness often comes from the most surprising places. Ruth McAllister, who had buried 3 children and thought her chance at motherhood was over, discovered that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to love someone enough to risk everything for their well-being. Her empty nest became full again, not through birth, but through the simple act of opening her heart to someone who needed a safe place to heal. This isn't just a story about the Old West. It's about how any of us at any age can start over when we find people who value us for who we are, not what we can give them. Love multiplies when shared, and sometimes our greatest joys come disguised as someone else's greatest need. Have you ever experienced unexpected kindness from a stranger that changed your perspective on life? What moment in your later years surprised you with new hope or purpose? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.